In the spring of 2009, Vivian Lacombe, a woman of 28 with soiled dark hands and her grandmother's stubborn jaw, was informed that her world was about to be divided. She was not consulted. She was not invited to negotiate. She was summoned by way of a printed letter with an embossed letterhead to a temporary site office at the edge of her family's lavender and honey farm in the Okanagan Valley, British Columbia, and told in the polite, pressurized language of men who have never had to grow anything that a luxury golf and spa resort was going to be built on the hillside directly above her land. Let me tell you about that meeting. The office was a modular trailer parked on a gravel pad that someone had poured over what had until very recently been a field of wild clover. It still smelled faintly of it underneath the plastic and the fresh paint and the ambition. Two men sat across a long folding table from Vivian. The first, who did most of the talking, was Mr. Harwick, Regional Development Director for a Vancouver-based hospitality group called Summit Crest Properties. He was a trim man in his 50s with silver hair and the kind of even tan that comes from business travel, not from working outdoors. The second man was quieter. He took notes. His name was Mr. Bellamy, and he had the careful, watchful energy of someone whose job was to remember everything said in rooms like this one. Mr. Harwick had a presentation. He had a laminated site map. He had renderings of the resort, printed in warm sunset tones, showing a gleaming series of pavilions and fairways cascading down the hillside toward the valley floor. At the very bottom of the rendering, almost cropped out entirely, was a small patch of purple, Vivian's Fields. He spoke about the regional economic benefits. He used the word transformative 4 times. He mentioned that the Okanagan was, in his words, an underdeveloped gem in Canada's luxury travel portfolio, and that Summit Crest was prepared to be a steward of that potential. Then he leaned forward, and his tone shifted from presentation to conclusion, the way a door shifts from open to shut. "Now, Miss Lacombe," he said, smoothing his tie over the laminated map, "we understand that a family property carries a great deal of emotional weight. That's natural. It's understandable, which is why Summit Crest has put together a very generous acquisition package for your parcel. You'd walk away with enough to buy yourself a beautiful new property, something easier to manage, something perhaps a little more suited to a—" He glanced at her flannel shirt, at the dried wax on her knuckles from the morning's hive inspection, "to a fresh start." He slid a folder across the table. Vivian didn't open it. She looked past him, through the small rectangular window at the end of the trailer. She could see the east field from there, just barely. The lavender wasn't in bloom yet. It wouldn't be for another 6 weeks. But she knew what it looked like when it was. A bruised purple sea, slow in the breeze, full of sound. Her grandmother had planted the first rows. Her mother had doubled them. Vivian had learned to read the weather by the way the bees moved through it. "The farm isn't for sale, Mr. Harwick," she said. Her voice was even, unremarkable. It landed in the room with a weight that surprised him. He cleared his throat. Mr. Bellamy stopped writing. "Messieurs Lacombe, I want to make sure you understand the full scope of what's happening here. We will have construction vehicles on that hillside within the month. There will be equipment, access roads, drainage work. The dust alone will—" "I know what construction looks like," she said. He blinked. "The farm isn't for sale." She picked up her jacket and left. Behind her, through the thin wall of the trailer, she heard Mr. Harwick say something in a low voice to Mr. Bellamy. She didn't catch the words, but she heard the tone. It was the tone of a man recalculating a minor inconvenience. She drove back to the farm with both hands on the wheel and the folders still on the table behind her. "Now, let me tell you something about Vivian before I go any further. She was not the type to carry a sign or speak at town council or fire off letters to the editor. That wasn't stubbornness. It was temperament. She had grown up watching her grandmother handle difficulty the way the old woman handled a hive. Slowly, deliberately, with the understanding that panic made things worse. Her grandmother, Eugenie, had come to the Okanagan from Quebec in 1961 with a suitcase, a coffee tin of savings, and the conviction that lavender grew better in dry heat than anyone in her family had been willing to believe. She had been right. She had been right about most things. Eugenie had passed 4 years before the trailer appeared on the hillside above her farm. She had left Vivian, the land, the hives, the farmhouse with its uneven floors, and a particular piece of advice that she had repeated so many times over the years that Vivian had stopped hearing it consciously and simply absorbed it, the way a field absorbs rain. People build things to impress each other, Eugenie used to say, sitting on the back porch in the evening, a glass of cold water in her hand. We build things to last. Those are not the same project. Vivienne had not truly understood it then. She was beginning to understand it now. The construction began in June. By July, the hillside above the farm was unrecognizable. The yellow pine that had stood along the ridge for as long as anyone could remember came down in a week. Grading equipment moved in and began reshaping the slope. The sound of it reached the farm from first light until the evening whistle. A fine red dust settled on everything, on the lavender rows, on the white boxes of the hives, on the windshields of the old farm trucks lined up by the barn. Vivian covered the hives with mesh. She soaked the rows with extra irrigation to keep the dust from choking the soil. She lost sleep she couldn't afford to lose. The town had opinions. In Summerland and Oliver both, people who had known her family for 30 years offered them freely over grocery store counters and post office lineups. Can't blame her for wanting to hold on, one woman said, not unkindly, at the Saturday market where Vivian sold her honey. But those boys from Vancouver, they don't stop when they get started. Should have taken the money while it was on the table, a man said to someone else, not quietly enough, while Vivian was loading her truck 2 stalls down. She heard it all. She filed it away. She went home and checked the hives. There was a night, I want to be precise about this because it matters, in the 2nd September of construction. A heat event had come through the valley, unusual for that time of year, dry and pressing and relentless. The lavender had finished blooming, but the heat was stressing the plants in their post-bloom state, drawing moisture out of the soil faster than irrigation could replace it. Vivian had been out in the field since 4 in the morning adjusting drip lines. By 11 that night, she was back at the farmhouse, sitting at the kitchen table with her boots still on, her hands shaking slightly from the physical and the heat and the particular exhaustion that comes not from effort alone, but from sustained uncertainty. The hillside above her was lit with the construction crew's overnight security lights. They burned blue-white against the dark, a cold artificial constellation sitting on top of the ridge where the pines used to be. She could hear, faintly, the sound of a generator. The folder from Mr. Harwick's trailer was in the kitchen drawer. She had never opened it. She had just moved it from the seat of her truck to the drawer without looking inside, the way you move something you're not ready to deal with. She got up. She crossed the kitchen. She put her hand on the drawer handle. She stood there for a moment. On the windowsill above the sink, her grandmother had kept a small ceramic pot glazed in a deep blue that Vivian had always thought looked like the sky just after dusk. Eugenie had brought it from Quebec. She kept a dried sprig of lavender in it, replaced every year from the new harvest. When Vivian moved into the farmhouse, she had kept the pot exactly where it was, and she still replaced the sprig every year in August, because the ritual felt true in a way she couldn't have explained to anyone. She looked at the pot. She thought about her grandmother's hands, broad and unhurried, moving through the hives without gloves, because Eugenie said the bees knew the difference between a nervous hand and a calm one. She let go of the drawer. She filled the kettle. She sat back down. She drank her tea at the kitchen table until the sky outside began to lighten, and then she put her boots back on and went back to the fields. She did not visit that drawer again. The resort opened in the late spring of 2011. Summit Crest called it the Ridge at Okanagan Falls. It had 4 buildings of reclaimed wood architecture designed to suggest rusticity while delivering every conceivable comfort. It had a destination spa, 2 restaurants, a curated wine cellar featuring exclusively BC labels, and a golf course that swept down the hillside in long, manicured curves. From the 18th fairway, from the resort's tiered terrace restaurant, from every balcony of the main lodge, you could see straight down into the valley below. You could see Vivienne's farm, the lavender fields, laid out in long parallel rows, were a kind of purple geometry that the resort's landscape architect had not accounted for and could not have planned. They were visible from the 4th hole. They were visible from the spa infinity pool. They were in the language of the resort's own promotional photography, which began appearing in travel magazines the following year, described as part of the property's authentic Okanagan pastoral setting. The lavender that Vivienne's grandmother had planted was now being used to sell room nights at $400 a piece. At first, it was just looking. Golfers would pause mid-round on the lower fairways, shading their eyes, watching a woman in a wide-brimmed hat moving slowly through the purple rose below. Spa guests would stand at the infinity pool's edge longer than they meant to, not looking at the view they'd come for, the lake, the mountains, but looking down. There was something in the quality of movement down there, unhurried, purposeful, real in a way that the curated wood beams above their heads were not. The first actual contact happened on a Wednesday in June, the summer after the resort opened. A couple from Toronto. She was an architect. He worked in finance. Were playing the lower holes of the golf course when they came to the fence line where the resort property ended and the farm began. Vivienne was nearby, pulling a section of irrigation line that had come loose from its stake. She looked up. "Sorry to bother you," the woman called over. She had the slightly embarrassed tone of someone speaking across a fence they hadn't known was there. "Is that lavender? Is that your farm?" "It is," Vivienne said. "Does it? Is it, like, open? Can you actually go in?" Vivienne stood up. She looked at them for a moment. 2 people in golf clothes, clubs propped against the fence post, not looking at the course behind them but at the fields in front of them. "Come around to the front gate," she said. "I'll show you." She spent 40 minutes walking them through the rows. She told them about Eugenie. She told them about the particular strain of lavender her grandmother had brought from Provence by way of a seed exchange in Montreal. She showed them the hives. The man stood very still in front of one of the open boxes. He had never been close to a working hive, and something happened in his face. The architect crouched down to look at the soil and asked careful, genuine questions about drainage and root systems. They bought 3 jars of honey and a bundle of dried stems. As they were leaving, the man stopped. "The restaurant up there," he said, gesturing vaguely up the hill. "The nice one. Do you know if they use local honey? Or local anything, really?" Vivienne looked at him. "I wouldn't know," she said. She knew. The Ridge's flagship restaurant, Canopy, had a menu that emphasized the local and the artisanal, but its suppliers were largely from the lower mainland. The honey in the small ceramic pots on every table at Canopy came from a distributor in Langley. It was, as honey went, perfectly adequate. It had no particular story. It tasted like honey. Now, have you ever had an idea that arrived not as a plan, but as a recognition, as though you'd always known something and simply hadn't looked at it directly until this moment? That evening, Vivian drove into town and bought a piece of painted plywood from the hardware store. She spent an hour at the kitchen table with a can of barn-red paint and a wide brush. The sign was not elegant, but it was legible. Lacombe Farm, Guide Hive Tour Days, 10 a.m. She put it at the end of the gravel lane where it met the road. 8 people came the first Saturday. 3 of them were guests from the Ridge, still in their resort-branded bathrobes and sandals, who had driven down the access road on a whim. They stood in the farm lane, looking slightly startled at themselves and very pleased. Vivian walked them to the hives, gave them each a smoker to hold, explained the colony structure, let them taste honey directly from a capped frame. They stayed for nearly 2 hours. They bought everything she had on the small table she'd set up by the gate: honey, beeswax, candles, small bars of lavender soap she'd been making for years for the farmer's market. The next Saturday, 14 people came. 11 of them were from the Ridge. The Saturday after that, she stopped counting before the morning was over. What was happening was not complicated, but it was profound. The resort had given its guests every amenity that money and design could produce, and those guests, educated, traveled, with enough resources to be anywhere they chose, were putting on their shoes and walking down the hill to stand in a field and listen to a young woman in a worn canvas hat explain why bees know when a storm is coming. They were hungry for something the spa menu couldn't provide. Vivian understood this in the way her grandmother had understood it. Not as a business insight, but as a simple truth about people. The craving for something unperformed, something that hadn't been staged for them. Word moved the way it always moves in a place people are passing through. Quickly, sideways, through dinner table conversations and group chats, and the small social negotiations of people deciding how to spend a finite vacation. By the second summer, the question at the Ridge's concierge desk had shifted. It was no longer whether guests were aware of the farm. It was whether the concierge could help secure a spot on the Saturday tour. Could they call down to the farm? Was there a booking system? Was Vivienne taking private groups? She was not initially, then she was. She built a simple booking page on her existing farm website, which had previously existed only to list honey varieties and farmers' market dates. She kept the Saturday tours at 15 people maximum. She added a Tuesday evening option in summer, which she called the dusk round, during which she opened the farm at 6 o'clock, walked guests through the hives as the light went amber, and ended the evening on the back porch with cold lavender lemonade and a small tasting of her different honey harvests set out in ceramic dishes. The dusk round filled within hours of being posted. It has filled the same way every week since. The management at the Ridge noticed the numbers before they understood the cause. Conference call minutes from that period, which I am summarizing here from what was later described to me, show a pattern of bafflement. Spa bookings were being canceled for Tuesday evenings. The Canopy restaurant was reporting a consistent drop in dinner covers on the same nights. Guests were leaving the property mid-afternoon on Saturdays and not returning until well after sunset. A junior staff member was sent to investigate. She came back and reported, in some bewilderment, that the guests were at a farm down the road, looking at bees. There was a board call. Terms like competitive adjacency were used. Someone suggested partnering with the farm for branded honey amenities in the guest rooms. Someone else suggested acquiring the property again. Mr. Harwick, who was still regional director, said very little. The situation reached its own version of irony the following June, in the 3rd summer since the resort had opened. The Ridge had designed its golf course with a service path running along the lower edge of the property, intended for maintenance carts. By 2013, This path had been worn smooth not by maintenance carts, but by resort guests walking, in golf shoes, in spa slippers, in bare feet, down the hill to Lacombe Farm. The resort's head groundskeeper had taken to calling it the Honey Trail, a name that began as sardonic and became, over time, simply accurate. Summit Crest eventually contracted a local shuttle service, 2 small electric carts, Ridge branded, running a continuous loop between the main lodge and the entrance to Lacombe Farm on Saturday mornings and Tuesday evenings. The shuttle had been proposed internally as a guest satisfaction measure. It was, in another sense, a formal acknowledgement that their guests preferred somewhere else. Vivian watched the first branded shuttle pull up to her farm gate on a Saturday morning, carrying 6 guests in matching Ridge robes, and she felt something that was not triumph and not satisfaction exactly. It was closer to recognition. The thing her grandmother had said, playing out at full scale in a small gravel lane in the Okanagan. They build things to impress each other. We build things to last. In the autumn of 2014, a car Vivian didn't recognize pulled up the farm lane on a weekday afternoon when no tours were scheduled. A man got out. He was older than she remembered him. He had the look of someone who had stopped trying to appear more relaxed than he was, which paradoxically made him seem more relaxed. Mr. Harwick, without the laminated site map, without Mr. Bellamy's note-taking. He stood at the gate for a moment, looking out over the lavender fields. They were past their bloom at that time of year, but the rows were still silver green, and the light on them in the afternoon had a quality that people always noticed and struggled to describe. Vivian came out of the barn. She waited. He said, "I was hoping we might talk." She brought him inside. She poured him a glass of water and set a jar of the late summer honey on the table. He tasted it with a small spoon she provided, the way she gave every first-time visitor. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "How much product are you moving through the farm now, roughly?" "Enough," she said. He nodded. That was a fair answer. He knew what it meant. He looked around the kitchen, at the dried lavender on the windowsill, at the framed photograph of Eugenie, taken sometime in the 70s, standing in the east field in rubber boots, squinting into the sun with an expression of absolute ownership. "We'd like to explore a formal partnership," he said. "Exclusive supplier agreement for canopy. Lacombe Farm honey, estate grown in every room. Your name on the menu. And we'd like to fold the farm tours officially into our guest experience packages, attribution, booking, support, a percentage." He paused. A meaningful percentage. Vivienne looked at him for a moment. "What changed?" she asked. He was quiet. Outside, the bees were working the remaining clover at the field's edge, even this late in the season. You could hear them if the room was still enough. "Honestly," he said, "please." He turned the honey jar in his hands. "We spent a great deal of money building something exceptional, and our guests keep leaving it to come here." He set the jar down. "We built on top of your farm, but you," he looked out the window at the fields, "you built something we can't replicate. We've tried quietly in 2 other properties. Curated farm experiences, local honey tastings, hired consultants." He shook his head. "It doesn't work the same way, because it isn't the same thing." He met her eyes. "It has to be real, and this is real." Vivienne was quiet for a moment. She thought about the folder in the kitchen drawer. She thought about the night with the kettle and the ceramic pot and the dried sprig of lavender. She thought about 8 people in their resort bathrobes, standing very still in front of a working hive, looking at something that had been here long before the ridge above them had a name. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded. He stood to go. At the door, he stopped. He seemed to be deciding whether to say something, and then he said it. "We told our people you were a young woman who didn't understand the opportunity in front of her." He didn't look at her directly. "I want you to know that I understood very early on that we had it backward." He extended his hand. "I'm sorry it took this long to say it." Vivienne shook his hand. It was not a victory. It was, if anything, a beginning of something she had already been building without needing his recognition, but which his recognition made, in some small way, easier to carry forward. She did enter a partnership with the Ridge, on her terms, negotiated slowly and carefully, with a lawyer from Kelowna she trusted. Lacombe Farm honey is now listed by name on the canopy menu, with a line of attribution that reads, simply, Okanagan Valley, 3 generations. The farm tours are bookable through the resort's concierge system, but they are capped at her numbers, scheduled at her hours, and conducted entirely by Vivienne or, in the summer seasons now, by her younger sister Odette, who drove out from Montreal 3 years ago and stayed. Vivienne has not expanded the hive operation beyond what the land can carry sustainably. She has been offered investment twice. She declined both times without particular drama. The shuttle still runs on Saturdays and Tuesdays. The honey trail is still on the resort's unofficial internal maps, maintained now with proper gravel by the groundskeeping team, who have stopped calling it sardonic and simply think of it as the path to the farm. Vivienne Lacombe is in her mid-40s now. She moves through her fields in the early morning, before the tours arrive, with the same quality of attention her grandmother had, slow, unhurried, as though the land is a conversation she is always in the middle of. The east field is in full production. The hive count has grown carefully in line with the lavender. The farmhouse floors are still uneven. On the windowsill above the sink, the small blue ceramic pot still holds its dried sprig of lavender. Vivienne replaces it every August, in the 3rd week, when the harvest is in and the fields smell like something you cannot name precisely, but will remember for the rest of your life. Last summer, her sister's daughter, 9 years old, visiting for the school holidays, followed Vivienne into the east field one morning without being asked. She watched very seriously as Vivienne opened a hive and moved her bare hands through it without flinching. "Doesn't it scare you?" the girl asked. "It used to," Vivienne said. "Then I learned to be still." The girl thought about this. Then she held out her own hands, open-palmed, the way she had seen her aunt do it, and Vivienne showed her. The men in the site trailer came to the valley and saw a field to be built above. They saw a young woman who didn't understand leverage or scale or the direction history was pointing. They thought the story was about a golf resort coming to the Okanagan. They were wrong. The story was always about the farm in the valley, about what grows when you tend it with patience, and what you build when you build it true. They said her operation was untenable. The bees are still working.